Welcome back to Conflicts of Interest. This is episode 743, and today is January 12th, 2025. I'm the host of the show, Kyle Anzalone. Today, joined by my co-host, Connor Freeman. Connor, how you doing? Happy to have you back on the show, buddy.
I'm doing great, Kyle. Thank you very much for having me back on. Excited to dig into all the chaos we've been seeing in the final days of the Biden administration, especially in Syria, and the risks we run here for, escalation and potentially war with Iran coming soon.
Yeah, certainly it is going to be, I mean, potentially an exciting another 4 years, but definitely the next few months here as so much is happening with the end of the Biden administration. What we had to look forward to as people start to spill the beans on what's been happening, Connor, and we find out just a little bit more about what's been going on behind the scenes and just how much of a train wreck, an absolute train wreck that it's been. And also now we have Trump, which at least is a lot more entertaining in the press conferences. But today, Connor, we have this new article that you wrote for the Libertarian Institute on January 6th, and we ran as the spotlight article this week at antiwar.com. Israel's newfound freedom of action portends regional war. And Connor, you have a quote in here that I wanted to start off with, and you write, or as Joe Biden put it on December 8th, during the past 4 years, my administration had pushed a clear and principled policy towards Syria. First, we made clear from the start that sanctions on Assad would remain in place. Second, we maintained a military presence in Syria. So, Connor, before we, dig into too much of what's going to happen, let's look at the past 4 years with Biden, and particularly what has he done in Syria that really set the stage for what we saw at the end of November and early December.
Sure. So when he came in and took over from the first Donald Trump administration, he essentially put the Syria policy on autopilot. So, in other words, the Caesar Act sanctions were maintained. Now, these are some of the strictest, most severe sanctions imposed on any country by the U.S. government across the world. And basically, what they do is they prevent any entity or individual of any nationality from helping Syria rebuild after the country has suffered hundreds of thousands of deaths, millions displaced, and hundreds of billions of dollars worth of damage as a result of the dirty war that was pursued in an effort to overthrow Bashar al-Assad in Damascus by backing namely the Jabhat al-Nusra Front, which is the Syrian al-Qaeda affiliate led by Abu Muhammad al-Jalani, and as well as their ISIS cohorts and other internationalist jihadists. But this was supported by the United States, well, particularly the CIA, but also Israel, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Qatar, Britain, France, and some of their other partners. And so the Caesar Act sanctions, which were supported on a bipartisan basis in Congress, made sure that the country could not rebuild unless there was, what they would euphemistically refer to as a political solution, right? Which really means Assad must go. The Barack Obama policy of that Assad must be overthrown and nothing else can change that. We're not willing to accept any other kind of option. Was really the consistent policy throughout both the Donald Trump and the Joe Biden administration. So under Donald Trump, a lot of these same policies carried over into Biden, meaning you had the Israelis bombing Syria virtually every week, killing civilians, killing Syrian Arab Army personnel, usually not acknowledging the strikes, but bombing critical infrastructure. And we saw escalations of that under Biden. So we saw lots of bombings of particularly critical pieces of the Syrian sort of state, like the Aleppo International Airport, which was crucial for bringing in aid after the earthquake that took place in Turkey and Syria during Biden's term. You also had, which was in, I believe, February of 23, but you also had the constant bombings of the Damascus International Airport. And as soon as the Syrian government they would begin to repair or get the airport up and running again, the Israelis would come by and bomb it again. And after the dirty war got out of control and Russia came in 2015, along with the help of Hezbollah, the IRGC, and the Iraqi Shiite militias on the ground who aided the Syrian Arab army in beating back the Islamic Caliphate and the Al Qaeda forces in the country and their affiliates, and pushed them all into the Idlib province, where they remained under the protection of the Turks and basically stayed there and festered and created their own Islamic state, where they imposed Sharia law. And as we're seeing, a lot of these people now being brought into the administration were carrying out, brutal executions of people under these laws, shooting women in the head in the middle of the street for adultery. And some of the men who presided over these kinds of killings and executions are now, one of them is now the justice minister of the new government. But so the country was devastated by these sanctions. And so by the end of 22, I believe the UN Special Rapporteur for Unilateral Coercive Measures was already pointing out that 90% of the population in Syria live below the poverty line, with very limited access to necessities like food, water, medicine, fuel, cooking oil, transportation. And so
And
this
lots of power outages and things like that too, right, Connor? It was just a way that no person in the U.S. would be able to recognize living,
yeah.
and a lot of that was because of the U.S. sanctions. I know you could go on. I just that's the one that always gets me, because especially now that we have a baby in the house, if there's like no power, that would be a huge deal. And so this is what Syrian people live with day in and day out is massive. It's absolutely massive.
Absolutely. And the fuel shortages as well were largely a result of U.S. and Israeli policy, because the Israelis were attacking Iranian ships that were trying to transfer oil over to Syria. And, with U.S. support, of course. And then another major aspect of this is that the U.S. occupied roughly a third of Syria in the northeast, where they were backing the Kurdish-led SDF and stealing the oil and the wheat resources from the country. And that's where the bulk of their oil and wheat is based. And as Eric Margulies points out, and I quote him in the article, this severely damaged the Syrian Arab army, because this is where a lot of their salaries were coming from. So they weren't getting paid. And then you have to look at, again, since October 7th, there's been a massive escalation of Israeli targeting of Syria. I believe before Jelani took power, they had already launched, since October 7th, well over 200 airstrikes into Syria. And so, of course, you have to look at what was going on in Lebanon. Hezbollah had been decimated largely as a result of the campaign in southern Lebanon and further north, with the target, not just the killing of Nasrallah and the pager attack, but just the bombing throughout the whole country. Really, that took over all. I mean, Hezbollah had to just focus on protecting their own country instead of defending Assad. So you have the Syrian Arab army that's impoverished and unwilling to fight. And then you have Hezbollah, which can no longer come to the defense of Damascus. And it basically paved the way for an Islamist takeover of the country. And the Israelis had severely weakened the Syrians as well, bombing, their military and any sort of weapons transfers making their way to Hezbollah. That was always the ostensible reason. But either way, all of those factors made it much easier for Al Qaeda, or what they call Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, to take over the country.
And Connor, I just want to focus, because you just put out a lot of information right there about a lot of different actors who all kind of had different things that they were doing. Turkey was directly involved in supporting. Ukraine had their small hand in it. Of course, the United States' massive role, and as you mentioned there, Israel's role. And looking back on it, Connor, I remember over the past year or so, we've covered stories from Jason Ditz at antiwar.com, where he mentioned that Israel was bombing Lebanon, but not just in southern Lebanon, but up north and near the Syrian border. And do we have any idea, like, how coordinated this was between the United States and our different allies in the region? Turkey, Israel, Saudi Arabia would maybe be another player here. Ukraine, of course, again, had a hand in this. And over the long term, or do you think it was just maybe circumstances happened and Jelani saw an opportunity and he took it?
Yeah, I mean, I think we know from reporting throughout the Biden administration, there's particularly that piece in the Wall Street Journal that discusses how CENTCOM and the Pentagon would review the vast majority of Israeli strikes before they took place in order to approve them because they needed basically flyover permission over these illegal U.S. bases. And so most of this would be coordinated with the U.S. It would, I mean, we'd have to presume that. And I'm not exactly sure to what extent the Turks and the Ukrainians and the Israelis were all working together in concert with the Americans, but it seems like a very definite convergence of interests and policies. And basically they all had a similar goal here, which was to weaken Russia's position in the region, but also to take Assad out, so that, for instance, you could have a government that could more severely target the Kurds, because we've seen the Turks bombing the Kurds, including in U.S. occupied territory in Syria throughout Biden's administration without much resistance at all from Washington. And we also know that it's a critical objective of the Israelis to remove Assad so that they can basically cut the ability for Tehran to transfer weapons by way of Iraq and Syria to Hezbollah and Lebanon, which would give them greater freedom of action. So that's an interesting point. I mean, obviously, I think the targeting of the border areas between Syria and Lebanon had a lot to do with weapons transfers. That would be my first assumption. But I mean, all of that seems to be connected in, if not specifically like they were planning it all out together. It is, like I said, the a convergence of interests in the region for all these different states to increase their power and control over Syria, because it really has been divided up, where you have Turkey occupying territory in the north, the Americans occupying a third of the country in the northeast, and you have the Israelis, I mean, really escalating their expansion of territory well beyond the Golan Heights now, within 15 kilometers of Damascus. And so, yeah, it does seem, and I don't think that that's a workable strategy, as we can get into later. It does. There's already discussions in the Israeli sort of security establishment about the threat here that's now posed by the fact that you have an Al Qaeda-led so-called transitional government that's backed by Turkey. I think they might have bitten off a little bit more than they can chew here, and are not sure if that's going to be as stable as they'd like it to be, and even in the near term.
Okay, so let's start to get into this, Connor, because I think this is a lot of the really interesting stuff to unpack when it comes to Syria now. And I was talking to Dave DeCamp a little bit about this on the recent episode of the Kyle Anzalone show. If people want to go over and subscribe to the channel, that is the first link in the show notes page. But Connor, I want to know your take on this, because Washington's kind of in an interesting position here, right? We have our Kurdish allies in Syria, who are the enemies of our Turkish allies in Syria, who are backing Al Qaeda in Syria, who I guess is kind of our ally in Syria for that reason. And then we have backed Israel in Syria. And, there's a recent statement by the new Israeli Foreign Minister, Gideon Saar, where he called, the new government in Damascus extremist. And so it doesn't seem like Israel is going to be content with Jolani ruling Damascus, even if, say, the Biden administration would have been. So, that's a lot to break down. I guess let's start first with Turkey in the Kurds. Where do you think ultimately the U.S. or the Trump administration comes down? Does Turkey take a large swath of Syria? Do the Kurds bat down? Does the U.S. effectively abandon the Kurds and they fight a losing war against Turkey? What's the outcome here?
Not it's difficult to say. I mean, the Turks really did attack the Kurds severely under the Trump administration, without much resistance, so long as they don't attack the Americans. And this is kind of what we saw back in 2023, before October 7th, going on in Syria with the Biden administration, where they were targeting oil infrastructure that is controlled by the Kurds and, of course, the Americans, by extension. And yet there wasn't really much of a response. I think they would probably like to cut a deal with the Turks to have some sort of I don't know if you would call it a demilitarized zone. I know the Kurds are suggesting currently that they would like to have American and French troops come in and set something up like that, where they can have sort of peacekeeping forces there. And this would have been a lot easier to deal with if Assad was still in power and the Americans had a sensible policy where they could go in there and basically make a deal where they would provide the Kurds protection from the Turks, but also make sure that the YPG and the SDF don't pose any sort of a threat to Turkey, because of course they're not the same as the PKK terrorist group based in Turkey, the Kurdish terrorist group, but they're ideologically affiliated strongly with each other, and so that's one of Turkey's reasons for targeting the Kurds so much. But I think the Americans are caught in a real hornet's nest here, and we apparently have so many more troops now than we were initially told, and if they're now just telling us that they have 2,000 troops actually in Syria, not 900, and that's to say nothing about the contractors, the military contractors that are there as well. I mean, you've got a lot of American troops now that are caught in a crossfire potentially, because the Turks and the Kurds and the Syrian National Army, backed by Turkish air power and artillery, are fighting right now in Manbij and Kobani and over these dams in the northeast that basically provide 90% of the electricity to the region. All of that poses a lot of problems for the American occupying forces. So I'm not sure how they're going to deal with it. If Trump's position, how different it will be, how he'll deal with Erdogan versus what Biden has done. But usually the Americans just throw the Kurds under the bus. So it really depends on what level of destruction they're willing to accept here in the near term, with the SNA backed by the HTS government, and the Turks going after the Kurds here. But the Turks are talking about intervening directly soon, and I mean they already are, but they would escalate that involvement. So,
but to a real military invasion, what they're
right.
talking about. And Connor, I mean, this seems to be maybe the easier call to make in the situation in Syria, where there is at times a clear pecking order in the U.S. alliance. We see this when they decide where the different weapon systems get doled out first, who gets the new Patriots or the new F-35s. And usually, typically, near the very, very top of that list is Israel. And maybe, 1A, 1B situation here, we then have members of the NATO alliance. And so certainly Turkey as a member of NATO, you would think would mean much more to Washington than our alliance with the SDF or the YPG, because I'm sure, the Arab fighting forces under the YPG, under the SDF, would be just as happy to fight for Assad or whoever than they are the Kurds. I think a lot of that is conscription anyways. And so the easy move, I think, there would be to, of course, throw the Kurds under that bus. And that's the long Washington playbook suggests that. However, far harder to predict is what would happen if Turkey, a U.S. NATO ally, is picking a fight with Israel in Syria. Maybe this would occur enough through proxy forces that the U.S. feels it could back Israel against the Turkish proxies, the SNA and Al-Jawlani's bunch, without upsetting Turkey too much. But this seems like a real kind of difficult time to be an empire, Connor.
Yeah, I mean, no, and I totally agree. I mean, what it comes down to, I think, as far as the position that the Kurds are in between the Americans and the Turks, the Americans just want to control that territory. I don't think that they're going to, really get in any sort of kinetic conflict here with the Turks. I mean, that just seems unthinkable when you're talking about, like you say, two NATO allies here, and the Kurds are to put it bluntly, from the perspective of Washington, they've always been expendable. And so I think the primary interest here for the Americans is to maintain that the control of that territory in Syria. As far as the Israelis, the issue is, and I think this is an important point that Scott Horton brings up all the time, which is that, Jelani might not want any sort of a war with Israel. I mean, he's been happy to take well over 800 airstrikes since taking power. They're knocking out all these different ammunition depots and warehouses and air defenses and other military facilities left over from the SAA. But now the Israelis are talking about how they feel threatened by having Al Qaeda ruling a capital city next door. And basically, the issue is, even if Jelani is more or less a sock puppet of the Americans, it doesn't mean that his underlings are going to put up with this Israeli territorial expansion so far beyond the Golan Heights at this point. Like I said, getting within 15 kilometers of Damascus, and surging in the settler population, and continuing their airstrikes in Syria. I mean, eventually there could be a real power struggle where somebody who's more hard-edged and more in line with sort of the Zawahiri bin Ladenite perspective, that Israel and America are the rightful targets of their organization, along with these other, whether they're U.S.-backed or not, but dictators in the region that they see as either supplicants of the Americans or just infidel leaders like Saddam Hussein, for instance. They will, or Bashar al-Assad for that matter, they could actually start attacking Israel, but they haven't yet. I mean, Al-Qaeda, to my knowledge, has never attacked Israel. What we have seen is ISIS attack Israeli forces once outside the Golan Heights, where they were basically working on behalf of the Israelis, or at least in concert with them, creating a buffer zone between the Syrian Arab Army and Hezbollah forces that were trying to wipe ISIS out, and keeping a buffer zone between them and the Golan Heights, and the occupied Golan Heights. And they accidentally attacked some IDF troops and apologized, according to an Israeli defense minister. But, like I said, these kinds of things could change. I believe there was also another ISIS attack, or an attack claimed by ISIS in Israel back in 2022. But those are the only two attacks I'm aware of. But like I said, especially when you're looking at the fact that they're absolutely exterminating the Palestinians next door, this has long been, and the bombings of Lebanon and the mass murder of Muslims throughout this area has been a long-held Al-Qaeda grievance. And so you can only keep a lid on that for so long. And I think there's long been a sort of debate between leadership and Al-Qaeda about what to do about this problem, where you have basically the Americans, even after 9/11 and certainly before 9/11, being the real benefactor of Al-Qaeda. The CIA, Saudi Arabia, and certainly in Syria, we've seen Israel being a major benefactor to Al-Qaeda throughout the Dirty War, and really helping them to take power here in December. But eventually, that can boil over, and you do have this issue where Turkey is backing these groups, and it's a major powder keg waiting to blow here. And that is their major concern, that Turkish military support behind HTS poses a threat that they're even saying, like I mentioned earlier, could be a bigger risk to them than, Iran's influence in Syria under the previous government, which really didn't pose much of a threat to Israel if they weren't trying to obliterate Lebanon. Or Gaza, for that matter. I mean, Hezbollah, to my knowledge, was not even really aware of the plans for the October 7th attack, but felt obligated, much like the Houthis, to come to the Palestinians' defense. And their country has suffered greatly for it, and so has Hezbollah itself. But really, I mean, this is the Iranians were not really there was not really much of a threat, other than the fact that they were bringing weapons into Hezbollah. So the problem again is you have the Greater Israel Project and the hawks in this far right coalition, who were hell bent on not just destroying Gaza and settling it and taking more and more land in the West Bank, but also in southern Lebanon. There's a huge settler movement for taking over land in southern Lebanon. And even under this current ceasefire, they're still stealing more towns or occupying more towns when they're supposed to be leaving, and still bulldozing homes and taking territory. So, I mean, it's just this is the problem that we run into when we are tied at the hip unconditionally with the Israeli apartheid state. Because, as they commit genocide and as I mentioned in the article, go to war with, roughly 5 countries or so at the same time, between Iran, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and Lebanon, you come into this very difficult situation from Washington's perspective, where we are absolutely at war with all of Al Qaeda's worst enemies, because they happen to be the Israelis' worst enemies as well.
Yeah.
And so it is, like you said, not a good time to be the American empire right now.
I guess, one more point from the Israeli perspective is there is a significant Palestinian population in Syria, and it's probably worth noting that initially, after the Arab Spring hit Syria and the uprising against the Syrian state, that the population, or the Yarmouk refugee camp south of Damascus, actually sided with the Syrian opposition, and that was rebel-held territory for quite some time. And so, there may be some allegiances there, or some people, again, it wouldn't necessarily have to be Jolani himself orders, you Syrians over there, are you Uyghurs who have fought with me in HTS, ally with those Syrians over there, or who are Palestinians, to go conduct an attack, but rather the Syrian central bank was looted. No doubt a lot of Syria's weapons depots were destroyed by Israel, but not all their weapons. And it doesn't take a lot of money and weapons and, a band of people who are, lunatics in their ideology, that they're willing to enact violence on civilian population. And also, the fact that you've driven those people crazy with the war in Gaza, right? You just flooded their, the number of dead children that come across people's screens is just absolutely huge. And I'm sure it has, just driven people absolutely crazy into violence. And so, I'm sure Israel looks at that and feels like, this is a real issue that they have to deal with. And of course, it's so much an issue of their own making, which is why, you can't go and just take out Saddam Hussein and not have the Islamic State. This is what
Yep.
happens when you remove these guys. So anyways, Connor, before we wrap up here, any, real final thoughts from your article that you want to nail down?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, that's the other point. I mean, like, look at the damage that the Houthis have been able to inflict on Israel's economy, and how they're continuing to launch missile and drone strikes into Israel, despite all the billions of dollars in air defenses that the American taxpayer has been forced to fork over to Tel Aviv to put together here with American contractors. But they're still getting these attacks off, and they're still virtually under blockade, and they're the most impoverished country in the Middle East, and they are willing to fight and die for what amount to their principles about their role in the world, and the fact that the Palestinians are their brothers under fire from the same empire that committed a genocidal war against them not long ago under the Obama, Trump, and Biden government. So now you talk about empowering Al Qaeda exponentially, not just because they put HTS in power, or help put them in power in Damascus. Now they have their own capital city. They rule an Arab country, at this point, but also. Or much of it anyway. But also, you've, like I said, been bombing and decimating all of Al Qaeda's worst enemies in the region, and ISIS's worst enemies too. And so you cannot fight this multi-front war for Israel without, severely empowering Al Qaeda. And so that's going to be a massive problem. And we're already starting to see, we're already starting to see blowback from this war, not just, the deaths of American National Guard troops, but also at Tower 22 in Jordan, near the border with Syria last year. But we're also seeing terrorist attacks in the United States. And I expect that to get much worse under Donald Trump. And the real issue is, I mean, as far as I can see, it looks like the Donald Trump administration is very eager and excited, the same way Tel Aviv is, to take this war next to Iran in a much more full-throated and direct way, because they see Iran as being very vulnerable right now, given that Damascus has fallen and Hezbollah can't be armed by way of Syria any longer. The air defenses have been knocked out, and they're now talking about launching strikes on Iran's internationally safeguarded nuclear energy program. And we see all these, all this hype, as Jason Ditz covers all the time at antiwar.com, about how, oh, the Iranians are now they're enriching uranium hexafluoride to 60%, but they've been doing that since April of 2021, when the Israelis did their massive sabotage attack on the Natanz nuclear facility, which is their main center for building centrifuges. And that was only to prevent diplomacy between Washington, well, indirect diplomacy between Washington and Tehran, to try and get the United States back into the Iran nuclear deal, which Iran had never violated and still hasn't. What they're doing in terms of increasing their uranium enrichment and breaking away from their obligations is totally permitted within the deal, because the United States has unilaterally abrogated their obligations and illegally exited the agreement when no one else was violating it. And so you have this issue where, because of the sanctions being reimposed, they weren't really lifted in the first place to the extent that they were promised at all. But the Iranians are enriching this uranium hexafluoride to 60% as a way of building leverage to bring at the negotiation table. But they can't ship that fuel overseas, or they can't ship that uranium overseas to have it converted into nuclear fuel. So in the meantime, the stockpile just keeps building up and building up. And so we get all this hype in the media right now in the last month about how now they're enriching to 60%, which has been going on since 2021, but they're acting like it's a new thing. And they point to the larger stockpile, which, as I said, is a result of the sanctions and the obstinance of the American government. And you do have a president who is a moderate now, who's got Javad Zarif in a very high up position in foreign affairs, who helped negotiate the JCPOA originally. And these guys want direct diplomacy with the Americans. They don't want to go through these endless talks like we saw in Vienna under Biden, where you have the Germans and the E3 and the Chinese and the Russians trying to pass messages back and forth between the Americans and the Iranians, and they get nowhere, because not only because of the Israeli terrorist attacks on Iran, but also because of their leverage and lobbying of the Americans where no one in Congress wants to support a return to the JCPOA, even though it makes perfect sense to relieve some of the tensions in the region. And so we have a wonderful opportunity here. Trump has, at least once that I'm aware of in the last couple of months, said that I absolutely would make a deal with Tehran. Why not? They just can't have nuclear weapons. So he doesn't understand what the JCPOA is. And the problem is, none of his advisors want to tell him the truth. And in the case of people like Pete Hegseth, I mean, Pete Hegseth was, Michael Tracy found a video of him on Fox News after the assassination of Qasem Soleimani on January 3rd, 2020, where he was saying, like, right now we need to be bombing Iran directly. Their mosques, their hospitals, their universities, everything, because here's the thing. Islamists use human shields. And so you have to just do away with international law because they use it against us. This is what terrorists do. So we have to bomb Iran directly. And, they're all real huge hawks. I mean, you just covered that story about Michael Waltz talking about, he goes, we're going to have this massive shift from the Biden administration, but it's basically the same old plan. He's like, we're going to align with Israel. What a brand new, fresh idea. I mean, this is what we voted for, right? And we're going to double down on the Abraham Accords NATO coalition style strategy to build up against Iran with all the Arab states and the Israelis. Now, I don't think that's going to actually work because the Iranians have normalized relations with at least 3 out of the 4 Abraham Accords states. They made this landmark peace deal in the beginning of 2023 that was brokered by China, where Riyadh and Tehran made peace, and now they have some economic cooperation, and I don't think they want to spoil that. However, if the Americans and the Israelis are hell-bent on war, and they start a war with Iran, those countries are all at risk, so they may see it as even though it's going to be devastating for their economy, it's like their really only best option here is to just, I don't know, get on board with the American campaign for war. But there's going to be a lot of hype. We're going to see a lot of lies about Iran. It'll be a total deluge. And I don't trust the Trump administration to be as frank as the Biden administration was at critical moments, where they would just have, William Burns come out and say, no, Iran is not building nuclear weapons. They are not moving to build nuclear weapons. And we've seen that in the National Defense Strategy and the Nuclear Posture Review under Biden, even though it wasn't reported in the mainstream press. Ted Snyder wrote about it at antiwar.com, but it wasn't made a big deal of at all in the American corporate press. And the IAEA has been very forthright about how Iran is not seeking to build nuclear weapons, and they talk about the risk of Israeli sabotage attacks. But these IAEA reports that come out and they're given to member states that are supposed to be secret are always reported on in the media in advance. And as we saw recently, like I was talking about, this hype about the 60% enrichment is used by all the hawks to just convince the American people that Iran is trying to build a nuclear weapon. And it's not true. Israel has an illegal nuclear weapons program that makes, or a clandestine nuclear weapons program. They're not signatories of the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which means we are illegally providing Israel with military aid. And for a number of other reasons, we're not supposed to be doing that, given what they're doing in Gaza and the rest of Palestine and Lebanon. But, you run into this situation where the Donald Trump administration will be just as unhinged about Iran as they were in the first term. But like all the problems we're going to see under Trump, it's a result of the Biden administration just being, they have vastly escalated on every front since Donald Trump left office last time, whether it's with China, Russia, Iran, the Palestinians. I guess, maybe they're going to reignite the war in Yemen. Daniel Larison has that new piece in Responsible Statecraft that was run as a spotlight at antiwar.com recently, where you have Elliot Abrams, everybody, telling the Jerusalem Post that, there's going to be an escalation in Yemen. And if any American troops are killed or American airmen are killed by Yemeni missiles that are, Iranian missiles by their understanding, then we're going to attack Iran directly as a result of that. And so it seems like there's a major push by the neoconservatives and their allies in the incoming Trump cabinet to seize upon this opportunity with Iran temporarily in a weakened state to really rush here and go to war. And I don't know if they're going to support Israeli strikes on nuclear facilities or if they're going to hit Iran directly. I really hope cooler heads prevail. They have in the past. Certainly during the W. Bush administration and the Obama administration, when the Israelis have tried to push ideas like this. But we're dealing with a very different situation now in the wake of the genocide in Gaza and the expanded regional war. And the Donald Trump administration's position basically is that Joe Biden has abandoned Israel, which is just the total opposite of the truth. But that means that you're taking in a new government that has a completely warped and distorted view of what's actually the problem in the Middle East. And it can be summed up by what Michael Waltz said to Mark Levin, which is that our understanding and our philosophy is that all the problems in the Middle East emanate from Tehran, not from Tel Aviv. And that's the opposite of what's actually happening right now.
All right, Connor, thank you so much for returning to the show. We'll have to do it again soon.
Absolutely. Thanks, Kyle.